Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to Ahmed and CWJC Open Classroom Historical Denialism Silencing Justice, Home for Women, Palestine, and Gender and Sexual Violence. So I'd like to start with land acknowledgement. So the campuses of San Francisco State University on the San Francisco Peninsula and North Bay are located within the occupied territories of the Lamaitas Ohlone and coastal Miwok, who, along with the Southern Pomo, are organized as the Federated Indians of Greater Rancheria. On the East Coast, Dr. Abdul Hadi, could you do the acknowledgement?
Yes, and I would like to say that first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, صباح الخير, مساء الخير, مساء النور, buenos noches, buenas tardes, to everybody who's joining us from all over, and especially to Pakistan. I am on the East Coast of the United States, on the indigenous, unceded land of the Lenape people. I also want to acknowledge the people from Palestine who are joining us, as we in Palestine also want everybody who comes, visits, stays, lives to acknowledge that Palestine is an indigenous land that's colonized, that's occupied, that is unceded, and that will be liberated as well. So back to you, Dr. Kinakawa.
Yes. So first, we'd like to express our deep gratitude and appreciation to those of you who helped us organize this open classroom. And first, our esteemed panelists who have accepted our invitation and responded with feedback on about this open classroom. And we are really honored to be with all of you today. Dr. Abdul Hadi, would you like to?
I would also like to thank our graduate students, our junior colleagues, senior to be senior colleagues, both Late Ghulum, who is doing their MA in Ethnic Studies and Army Studies at San Francisco State University, who's running behind the scene, all troubleshooting and actually making this happen. And I'm hoping that Laith, you'll be able to show your face just for a little bit. Laith also is working on a project called Queer Tehrangelas, and Laith has just received an incredible, amazing PhD offer from University of Minnesota, where this was their top choice, and we are very proud of them, and we cannot wait for them to actually go on and start their doctoral program. We will miss them at San Francisco State, but we're so happy for you, Laith. The other graduate students who has been really working with us day in and day out is Saleem Shahadeh, who is all close to being Dr. Saleem Shahadeh. He is at UCLA, all but dissertation, ABD, doctoral candidate. And actually, Saleem today is at Birzeit in Palestine, watching from Birzeit, Palestine, connecting with the Birzeit University and the Right to Education campaign there, and attending the whole week of Israel Apartheid Week. So behind Salim and Laith have been really amazing, as did so many of our graduate students whom we are so proud of, as they work for Ahmed, as they work for ethnic studies, as they work and study for the indivisibility of justice. So thank you so much, along with our esteemed panelists, along with the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, for coming to work with us, along with the Decolonizing Sexualities Network. And I believe a couple of other colleagues have joined us in co-sponsorship, which we will announce as we go along. So welcome, and thank you so much.
Okay. So sorry. I'd like to also express our gratitude to our co-sponsors. So along with Ahmed Studies at SFSU, Come for Women Justice Coalition, with whom we conceptualized and planned this class, is a co-sponsor. And also we have an honor that Decolonizing Sexualities Network joined us to co-sponsor this open classroom. And I also would like to mention, to tell you, our classes that are joining today are students from our classes, and so we brought together my women and gender studies class and also Dr. Abdul Hadi's Ahmed classes, 3 Ahmed classes. And so my class is women and gender in U.S. history and society, WGS 150, and then Ahmed introduction to Arab and Arab American feminisms, and also colonialism, imperialism, and resistance, and also a course on Palestine. So I'd like to touch on in this context that we have been, Dr. Abdul Hadi has been fighting to defend Ahmed Studies program, and that she has been the only faculty member in Ahmed Studies, teaching 3 courses every semester, the new courses every semester, which is unusual for chair of the department and director of the department and like anyone else actually. And the Dr. Abdul Hadi had a huge victory in February when the faculty hearing panel for her grievance hearing ruled unanimously in favor of Dr. Abdul Hadi, stating that SFSU did not, SFSU need to be made accountable for failing to keep the promise of the Ahmed Studies as a to especially including 2 faculty lines that were promised decades ago, and they requested the university to stop the hostile environment for Dr. Abdul Hadi and Ahmed students and programs. And so the after that, President Mahoney of did vetoed the faculty panel's unanimous ruling, and so we are still fighting as we speak. And so we will talk more about this whole issue about how the historical denialism and censorship and so forth work at corporatized universities, and the roles that those universities and also higher administration play in like the censoring and silencing the anti-colonial, decolonial, anti-racist, feminist, queer narratives. And so, Dr. Hadi, would you like to?
Sure. And we just to continue that we are really proud to be able to offer another open classroom. Our open classrooms are our pride and joy. And it is really amazing to be able to have all of you join us and be able to bring in your wisdom, your knowledge, your critical understandings, and to be able to engage with the students, because we believe that the university is not a closed area. That is an ivory tower, and especially a public university like San Francisco State University. So we believe that it's really important for us to engage with each other, to engage with the community, to engage with the students, and to express what the spirit of 68, the strikers in 1968, one of them is with us today, and they will speak for themselves when their turn comes, but that they struck the students' longest strike in the history of the United States at San Francisco State University, led by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front, along with union allies, along with faculty, along with the community, along with the whole world, struck and demanded that the university be open for the communities from which the university students come, that the university is accountable in our research to our communities, that the curriculum must be decolonized, and that our own community members, and I talk community, I'm saying about all the communities of justice. I'm not talking only about Arabs, Muslims, or Palestinians, or in this case, broader Asian communities. I'm talking about all our communities of justice. All our students need to learn what the history is all about, what the history of this country is about, what the history of our communities are about. Because if people do not know the history gets erased. And our people forget about what's going on. And that enables the repression to continue. Thus, we fight against the silencing, and we fight against the erasure, and we fight to produce justice-centered knowledge. And in the process, we enjoy ourselves by building and bringing together our communities, because without love for the community, without having each other's back, there is no struggle. Or maybe reversing it, the struggle happens as a result of that. So I'm going to be turning it over to Professor Kinakawa to speak a little bit about the history of our collaboration before we bring in our esteemed guests and wonderful, I would say, comrades, because we are all comrades in the arms of struggle for justice and for the truth.
Great. So I'd like to speak very briefly, actually, about how this class was came about, and I think our I think we need to start with how the Dr. Abdul Hadi and Ahmed studies. Well, actually, Dr. Abdul Hadi has been the only full-time faculty member and director in Ahmed studies over these decades, but she reached out to our communities and has been doing many open classrooms, and that includes Day of Remembrance, Japanese American communities remembrance of the World War II internment, and the and also and many others. Like, there are many open classrooms that the Dr. Abdul Hadi has done with local communities, and also like beyond the local communities, like the nationwide and also internationally. And so my collaboration with Dr. Abdul Hadi started because of what the Call for Women Justice Coalition and Dr. Abdul Hadi did together. And and we will talk about, like, in the next section, actually, about what took place. I think I'm saving it to the next section. So both as a colleague at SFSU, and also feminist scholar, and also as a member of Call for Women Justice Coalition, I started working with Dr. Abdul Hadi. And so the first, I invited her as a guest lecturer, a guest speaker for the Women and Gender Studies course. And I was worried because I didn't have any honorarium or any budget as a lecturer faculty. But Dr. Abdul Hadi accepted the invitation graciously. And then instead of doing like the regular guest lecture, she invited me to teach co-organize the Ahmed Open Classrooms together, two open classrooms in the semester. And then since then, we have co-organized 10 open classrooms, and this is the 10th open classroom that we have been doing together. And one of the open classroom got censored and silenced, which we'll talk about later. Yeah, Dr. Abdul Hadi, would you like to?
At this point, I think one of the things that maybe I'll speak about it later on. I think we should just bring in our esteemed speakers and then go back and talk about, the history of collaboration, where we work with each other and so on. I'm just very eager to hear them speak, and I'm sure you are too. So why don't we bring them in and then go back and continue what we were planning to do, if that's okay?
So I think we are handing this to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Judith Merkinson, and I'm the president of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, and on behalf, known as CWJC. And on behalf of CWJC, we want to express our deep appreciation and solidarity with Dr. Kinikawa and Dr. Hadi for inviting us to this historic collaboration to discuss the whole issue of historical denialism and censorship, and also to express to begin to build deep solidarity between all of our struggles. And I think it's particularly important at this particular moment when we see wars happening throughout the planet, when we see this horrible war in Ukraine, when over the weekend, the Israeli forces attacked the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Please forgive my mispronunciation. And when we see, especially when we look at everyday newspapers, and we know that we're not really getting the full story of what's going on in the world. And for us who talk about the comfort women, we're quite aware, particularly of the Japanese government and Japanese media, of not telling the truth about what happened to perhaps 500,000, but certainly hundreds of thousands of women who were sexually enslaved during World War II. And we also know that we're not getting the truth about what's happening anywhere in Latin America, in Palestine, in Ukraine, and that it's really incumbent upon us to be internationalists and to begin to build solidarity and to understand what is going on in the world. So it's a great honor for us to be here. And one example of great solidarity that has happened over the last couple of years is when we in CWJC and other members of the Asian and Asian American community discovered that there was a particularly flag on the side of the Tsunami restaurant, which I think is on Divisadero and Fulton Street. And this flag, as you can see, many people just consider this flag to sort of be a Japanese motif. And they don't understand that actually it's a war symbol. And so we had a big discussion about how we could take down this flag and to educate ourselves and our community and broader community about what this flag meant. And so we really want to honor Musa Dajani and others from the Tsunami restaurant who, after much discussion, agreed to take down the flag. And in order to do, and also Dr. Hadi, who facilitated that with us. And it was great solidarity between Palestine and other members of the East Asian community. So I want to turn it over to our esteemed co-chairs, Dr. Lillian Singh and Dr. Julie Tang, who will present these notices of appreciation.
Thank you, Judith. Maybe we can take down the slides for now. Thank you. I personally want to thank the Dajani brothers tremendously from the bottom of my heart. Musad and Khaled, we want to thank you so much for understanding our struggle and for working with us to use this occasion to help others understand what our struggle is and what cooperation between two communities who have been the subject of injustices have been able to come together and work together for victory. This whole thing happened, Dr. Dajani, when Julie Tang and I were on a Chinese radio station, and a caller told us about it. We didn't know anything, we didn't know it existed. So I went there and saw the flag on the wall, and we tried to reach to the owner of the restaurant. We didn't know it was owned by a Palestinian citizen. At that time, because of the historical denialism that Japan has done so well in silencing what happened in Asia during World War II, you didn't know anything about it. Most people don't know anything about it. I want to tell you, I was born in Shanghai, and the Nanjing Massacre, which was called the Forgotten Holocaust, because the Nanjing city, which was the capital of China at that time, surrendered itself to Japan, and Japan still killed over 300,000 Chinese citizens, not unlike what's happening in Ukraine. But the world did not say much about that atrocity, that Holocaust, that forgotten Holocaust. And then the women of Asia, not only China, but Korea, Philippines, 13 other countries that Japan occupied, were forcibly kidnapped and put into comfort stations to serve the Japanese soldiers as sex slaves. These are called comfort women stations. And so we want to do something about it, but the flag symbolizes the war crimes that Japan committed during World War II. Next slide, please. The next one, yes. Do you see the slide between the rising sun flag and the Nazi flag? They were flown together a lot during World War II. So as the Nazi flag symbolizes to all the victims of the Holocaust during World War II in Europe, the rising sun flag signifies the same thing. So the next slide, please. We didn't know who to turn to at that time because the Palestinian community and our community didn't really know how to communicate with each other. We were just as ignorant about the Palestinian community as I think you were not familiar with the plights and the issues of our community. So Dr. Abdul Hadi came to our rescue. This is our Comfort Women Memorial, where we honored the victims of the Comfort Women Station, a Korean, a Japanese, and a Filipino statue. Dr. Abdul Hadi was our guardian angel who was able to help us unite together and explain to each other about our issues. We learned a great deal about the Palestinian issues, as I believe you learned about our issues. Next slide. And guess what? Victory occurred. That horrible rising sun flag became this beautiful work of art that now stands at a Tsunami restaurant. This is such a beautiful victory for the two communities, but for world peace, we could have clashed. It would have been terrible. I hate to tell you, Dr. Dajani, but we were so upset. We're thinking about, having demonstrations, Chinese media and so forth. We didn't have to do that at all. Instead, we urge all our Chinese American citizens to come and visit your restaurant and to tell you how much we appreciate what you have done. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I'm going to give this to Dr. Judge Julie Tang to continue with this story in our presentation to Dr. Dajani, Khalid Dajani, and Musa Dajani of our Certificate of Appreciation.
Thank you. Let me first say how appreciative we are of Khalid Dajani Musa Dajani, and Rabab Abdul Hadi, and the Tsunami Restaurant for standing in solidarity with the Asian and Pacific Islanders in fighting denialism and hate. And it shows when oppressed communities stand together for humanity, we can win. During World War II, Judge Singh has already spoken about what happened. The Japanese Imperial Army brutalized Asia and the Pacific Islanders for more than 8 years. And the Japanese Imperial Army committed scores of atrocities. The sexual enslavement of women known euphemistically as the Comfort Women, Unit 731, biological and chemical warfare against POWs and civilians, the conscription of Koreans and Chinese young men shipped to Japan by corporations such as Mitsubishi and worked as slave laborers to create weapons for the war. The 4 years of incessant bombing of Chongqing and all the things that people still remember. So 25 million Asian people died as a result of the Japanese invasion of these countries. So these things are deeply embedded in our recollections. And unfortunately, much of those atrocities in different sizes and shapes and maybe even qualities and are still happening. And we now cannot afford to still hold on to our little universe. We have to step up and work together as human beings so that we can together squelch some of these horrible things that are ongoing. When we were notified, like Lillian said, by ordinary people that there were war flag paintings on the outside walls of the Tsunami Restaurant, we were just desperate. And when the owner of the Korean restaurant across the street told us that they were re-traumatized by looking at the flag every day, we knew we had to do something. We were just so fortunate that one of our own members, Grace Shimizu, a Japanese American, connected us to the Palestinian community with which we shared many common grounds for solidarity. We are grateful to Khalid Dajani, Musa Tajani for their courage and dedication to peace. We also thank Rabab Abdul Hadi for connecting us with Dajanis and assisted us in the removal of this racist imperial war flag. And I see that there will be a continuing of our solidarity and working to promote humanity and goodness in this world. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. Oh, by the way, I am retired Judge Julie Tang. I've never been called doctor, although we do have Juris Doctorate degrees, but I'm more comfortable when people call me Judge Julie Tang. Thank you so much.
We would like to now have the honor of presenting 2 certificates of appreciation, one to Musa Dajini and Khaled S. Dajini. The Dajini brothers are our heroes. We'd like to come to the restaurant personally and present this certificate of appreciation. In the meantime, we'll just do this online. Thank you, Dajani, Khalid, and Musad.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, thank you. Thank you. We appreciate the award. I mean, honestly, there was no need for it too, honestly, but we'd love to have it and we'd love to put it up in the restaurant. But the action to take the mural out and to take the painting out was the right thing to do. Honestly, we didn't know enough about the injustice this flag represented. I'm glad you guys approached us to increase our knowledge about it. We did educate all our staff about it because there were a lot of people, regular customers who come in, oh, what happened? Why is this flag out and stuff? And the staff, as we educated them, they did educate it. They did educate the customer about it. Anyway, Khaled and I, we're business owners, but we value to do the right thing above anything else. Again, we appreciate the award, and we look forward for you guys to visit us, and then have break bread again, like you guys mentioned earlier.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The next certificate, on behalf of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, we like to present our certificate of appreciation to Dr. Rabab Abdul Hadi, without whom we would never have met the the Dajani's brothers, and without whom the Dajani brothers may not believe what we have to say. So it's a good camaraderie of the work of Grace Shimizu and others who know Dr. Abdul Hadi that we're able to get together. So in appreciation for all the good work of Dr. Abdul Hadi, we'd like to present you with our certificate of appreciation.
Thank you so much. I am so touched and I'm so honored to receive this appreciation certificate, even though I believe that we are all doing justice work and working with each other, irrespective of appreciation or no appreciation. I think it's really important. I also want to appreciate you all, but I want to begin first with my brother Musa and Khalid. Musa said that we are owners. And it is true that when people take an action that is not just an action flippantly, but an action of solidarity, there is cost involved. And both Musa and Khalid thought long and hard about it and decided that doing the right thing is even more important than maybe losing some business here and there. And this is also very similar to what happens in Palestine, that many Palestinians are saying we are going to boycott Israeli goods that are participating in our repression, in our continued colonization, and our continued subjugation, as Judith Merck started speaking about what's going on as we speak now in Jerusalem and Aqsa Mosque throughout Palestine. Over 150 people were hurt yesterday, injured by Israeli bullets, by beating. People were arrested, people were martyred, children are being put in prison. But the Palestinian merchants who actually say we're not going to hold and carry Israeli goods in our stores, they are doing it and they know that they are going to lose business. And in this sense, what Musa and Khalid did was also quite exemplary. They recognize the justice for the Comfort Women Justice and the coalition that came behind it. They recognize that the Japanese imperial flag represents, as the Israeli flag represents to Palestinian communities, that it is a representation of injustice. And I also want to thank everybody who has historically, with whom I worked, from people back in during the 80s in New York with the Young Koreans United, who used to always go behind the indigenous dancers in all the protests on Palestine, banging the drums and participating. I want to thank the Organization of Asian Women, who has also historically been very supportive of us. I want to thank the various people in the Asian communities who stood by the Palestinians during the LA 8 case, and they came and they said never again for anyone. And this also, when I came to San Francisco, I had the honor and the privilege to meet people like Pastor Michael Yoshi, like Chris Shimizu, like Jill Shiraki, like Kira Azzam, like Tam, like many people who have been actually very supportive, very much standing by justice. And some of them are going to be speaking today. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but who actually, Representative Supervisor Eric Marr actually spoke at one of the protests we had outside of the courtroom before we won our lawsuit. I want to thank people who have actually taught us a lot about the history and the justice for all, that we cannot say we want justice in one place and deny justice in another. I want to thank you all because I've learned a lot from interacting with you, from participating with you, from hearing from all of you. And I want to really be very appreciative also of my comrade in arms and my colleague, Dr. Tomomi Kinakawa, Dr. Mihu, the judges, Judge Julie, Judge Lillian. You all came together. Steve, who's going to be speaking a bit later on. I mentioned everybody. You all have been with us day in and day out. You have been supporting us. You have not left us on our own. You've had our back. So I'm really appreciative, and I believe that the education that we bring in, because we are producers of knowledge, is so important for us to be able to defeat, challenge, silencing, challenge injustices, and achieve liberation for all our communities. Thank you.
Grace, we cannot hear you. You're muted. Oh, there you are.
Sorry. Let me repeat the wonderful things I said. I just wanted to give my own personal thanks, to the Dajani brothers and to Dr. Abdul Hadi for all the work that we've done to bring our communities closer together. The issue of the Rising Sun war flag is not just, in terms of what it has meant during World War II and how it triggers for a lot of our community here who lived through that and whose family members, remember that kind of trauma and the massacres, the medical experimentation, the sex slavery, the forced labor. But we also want to say that there's aggressive use of the flag, especially by ultra-nationalist right-wing groups in Japan and the Japanese government in recent decades. And it's really contributed to the increase of hate speech, violence, the discrimination against ethnic and national minorities in Japan, as well as the rising tensions and danger of war in the Asia Pacific. So I think what this collaborative effort between our communities, what it's helping is for us all to better understand in kind of this unfolding awareness and dialogue in our communities about the significance of these kind of symbols from our past, the attempts to rebrand and rehabilitate them, and how they're being used in the present, whether it's the Nazi swastika, the Confederate battle flag, the hangman's noose, the imagery of indigenous people in sports and statues, or like this Rising Sun war flag. So maybe to kind of weigh in on this too, is I'd like to introduce both Eric Marr and Steve Zeltzer to get their thoughts on this. Eric Marr is Professor Emeritus of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He was a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 2015, and he helped lead the battle to get the city to back the Comfort Women Memorial. And he's also a past president of the San Francisco Board of Education and just a longtime activist for over 35 years. And then Steve Zeltzer is also a longtime labor and community activist who's been supporting independent working class politics for a long time. He's a graduate of San Francisco State, and he supported the strike in '68. And since 1983, he's produced numerous labor TV shows and labor video documentaries, and he's presently producing and hosting a labor radio show on KPFA, Work Week. So he's also a longtime member of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition and the International Campaign to Defend Professor Rabab Abdul Hadi. So Eric, you want to start us off on this?
Sure. Thank you so much, Grace. And thank you to Dr. Kinakawa and Professor Abdul Hadi for sustaining all the attacks on Ahmed, and especially on the two of you for standing up for principle, justice, and solidarity. This is a great open classroom example of how, for Mr. Dajani to the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, learning from each other out of our own struggles to advance stronger unity and justice for all of our movements. I'm Eric Marr, Professor Emeritus from SF State in Asian American Studies. But as Grace said, I'm the former supervisor for the Richmond District in San Francisco. My twin brother represents the Sunset District as well. So I've been knee deep in the bureaucracy of government, and in some ways how different forces like Zionists to Japanese consulate and ultra nationalists try to muddle up and gaslight us and divide our movements. But I wanted to give a couple of examples of solidarity and alliance building that I think were important for me. I went to school at UC Davis in the 80s, And a lot of my learning came from, I was the editor of the Third World Forum, publication of radical and progressive people of color, Indigenous, African American, Palestinian, Asian Americans. And I learned a lot from the General Union of Palestinian Students, or GUPS, at UC Davis, as we were trying to learn about self-determination in South Africa, in Palestine, in Korea, in the Pacific. So we learned together, but one of the activists, Elias Rashmawi from GUPS, taught me a lot about my own privilege and how to be an ally, and to just shut up and listen to the voices that are being silenced by oppressors. I'll have to say that I learned about land acknowledgements in the 80s at the Third World Forum. I learned about how to challenge the university, like we have to challenge San Francisco State for their silencing, or their efforts to try to silence Palestinian students, but also Professor Abdul Hadi and Ahmed. I think also that I learned from UC Davis critical understanding of how to address my own privilege while being a good ally with the Palestinian movements for self-determination. I learned also about intersectionality at UC Davis when women activists within our publication also challenged the men to listen and to be better allies and to learn through struggle. Another place that I learned about alliances through Palestinians and others was KPOO Radio, where I was a programmer and DJ in the 1980s. I think I met Steve Zeltzer at that time, but Jess Ghanem and the Arab Talk show allowed me to learn a lot about different struggles. And in many ways, and Jess, as a professor at UCSF, later assisted with a lot of different issues at City Hall as well. But I just wanted to say that those are a couple examples of my lessons. When oppressors try to divide us and try to gaslight our movements by claiming that's something that happened in the past, I think it's important to increase the solidarity kind of and working together through open classrooms or other efforts as well. The significance of Ahmed and the Comfort Women Justice Coalition Alliance is so important right now as there's a rise in fascism, ultranationalism in Japan, and the remilitarization of Japan as well, and the whole Pacific region. So the alliance of Ahmed and Comfort Women Justice Coalition is even more important right now. The last couple of things I wanted to mention are 10 years ago, the judges, Judge Tang and Singh and I looked at different parks for a memorial for the Rape of Nanjing Redress Coalition that they were leaders of. And I'm so happy that the Rape of Nanjing Redress Coalition broadened to include other Asian Pacific Islander communities to broaden our memorial that we established in 2015 to 2017 to make it more universal. And to me, it represents a struggle for self-determination, like the Palestinian people's struggle is. And it's 12:45. It's a struggle also for women and Asian and Pacific Islanders to have a voice in our movement. So props to the organizers, and let's keep building stronger principled alliances and stronger solidarity among our communities. Thank you so much, Grace.
Okay, how about you, Steve?
Thank you for inviting me, and I think this meeting is very important, making the connections, and in the period we're in today of war, growing xenophobia and racism. I was in the San Francisco State strike, and as a student and a member of SDS at that time, and one of the critical issues in that strike was the fight for the Third World Liberation Department, Third World Liberation, that would cover the history of Blacks, Asians, Brown, Native Americans, and their history, which was being denied and still is under attack today in California and the United States. The right-wing attack on ethnic studies is an effort to cover up this history. So this issue of a struggle against denialism has very much connected to the San Francisco State Strike in 1968, and it continues on an international level. I've also been involved in this No Nukes Action Committee, which is fighting against more nuclear plants in Japan, and the denialism of the Japanese government that they've decontaminated Fukushima, which caused harm to the residents and workers there, and they're still trying to clean it up and remove the nuclear rods. The government, the Abe government, said that they decontaminated it in order to get the Olympics. They lied to the people of Japan and the world. It has not been decontaminated. So we have to look at why is the government of Japan lying about Fukushima, and in addition to that, the comfort women. I think this denialism has historical precedence because they want basically to continue to be able to get nuclear weapons, which come from these nuclear power plants. They get the plutonium. So on that level, the defense of nuclear power plants is a defense of further militarization and Japan becoming a nuclear power. And we can say, in my view, that the denialism of the comfort women, the effort of the Japanese government to deny that the Imperial Army was responsible for kidnapping women throughout Asia for sexual slavery, and to not deny that history, has to do with the effort to cleanse their history and prepare again for imperial interventions. And the effort in Japan today to get rid of Article 9 of the Constitution, to make Japan a full-fledged military power, is aimed at expansion, militarization. And we can also connect that really to Palestine. The effort to deny the Palestinian history is a part of a colonial project of the Zionists, supporters of a Zionist state, an apartheid state, and to deny the history of the people of Palestine. And I think that is the fabrication of history is really a defense of policies of imperialism and colonialism. I think that's what we're talking about. And on a global level, what we see today is a growth towards world war by imperialism. It's no accident that the United States is involved in Ukraine and uniting against Russia, because in addition to that, they're uniting against China and whipping up xenophobia and hysteria. The rise in xenophobia and anti-Asian attacks in the United States is directly related to the campaign against China, to blame the Chinese for COVID, to blame Chinese people and Asian people as a whole for the problems of capitalism, really, and imperialism. And I think we have to look, therefore, in looking at the attack on women, the attack on Asians, the denial of history, that there is an interconnection of these issues, and it's critical from an analytical method that we try to draw these connections. We have to draw the connections because they are connected, and we need to unite the peoples of the world against war. We need to unite the peoples of the world against denialism, and in this country, this is becoming a critical issue in the defense of ethnic studies programs, which are under attack. So I have to say that the fight that we made in '68 continues today, and I'm happy to see that this united effort to defend Ahmed, Professor Rabab Abdul Hadi and Professor Gunakara is critical. We in the strikers are working to build support for the program, and we really feel that this effort is critical, because actually this program does what we were trying to do in '68, and that's why there's so much hostility towards it among the administration, who support Israel, who are open Zionist supporters of an apartheid state, because they see this program as a threat to the continuation of their agenda, which is to deny the history of Palestine and to continue the oppression of Palestinians and Palestinian supporters in the United States and in education. And it's not an isolated incident, because other professors, Palestinian American professors have been harassed and bullied. Black professors who have supported the rights of the Palestinian people have been targeted and fired in the United States. So our struggle here is connected, particularly for academic freedom, and also against the tech companies who shut down the classes without a peep of opposition from the university, San Francisco State University. So the growing war threats, the use of these tech companies to suppress these programs is a threat to all of us. We have to continue this fight in education and take it up in the university system and in the labor movement, particularly. The Labor Council has passed a resolution against the attack, and we have to deepen that at the AFL-CIO convention, which is going to be in June in Philadelphia. This is a working class issue as well. So I think that we are making these connections. We're going to continue to build, and that's how I see the connection of my fight in '68 for the fight today to defend the Ahmed program.
Okay, back to you.
Dr. Kinakawa, do you want to go for it, or do you want? Just so you would know, we always do this, and we always sometimes, a lot of the time, play it by ear, and we do a very dynamic model because sometimes we plan everything and we say, maybe we need to shift her. So, Dr. Kinakawa, what should we do next?
Let me think. We were going to. I was able. Well, first of all, thank you so much. This ceremony, I think that really kind of teaches us like what Dr. Abdul Hadi has been theorizing about the indivisibility of justice. I think that is kind of it's right there in this ceremony, like the embodied, and so and that I really do appreciate the roles that are played by Dr. Abdul Hadi and also Mr. Rajani and all leaders of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, so I was going to talk a little bit about like how this historical denialism, like how the historical denialism is kind of supported by the institutions of higher education and also like other institutions of knowledge production, and like think tanks and so forth, and like how like Japanese historical denialism, Japanese far-right historical denialism actually collude with Zionism and white supremacy in those organizations, in those institutions. And so maybe could you show the slides? If so maybe 1, 2, 3, 4. Could you go all the way to page 6 if you could? Yes, so I just wanted to briefly touch, like this is very brief version, but I'd like to talk about like how the Japanese historical denialism and like Zionism actually colludes in like a very conservative think tank at in US and called Hudson Institute as a kind of example, and think about that as a kind of way to like think about how to build solidarity to fight against it, and then like how the Ahmed Ahmed studies and also Comfort Women Memorial, both of them as a very critical sites for resistance against this historical denialism that's like been like is very much like well the how to resist those all these forces. And so here I'm just wanted to point to that especially there, under Shinzo Abe, like Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, that he was one of the politicians who was behind like intensifying Japanese denialism and denying denialism. And part of what he was doing was that he spent lots of money, like it's called strategic overseas dissemination budget, to propagate the far-right Japanese government's view, which denied the Japanese colonial war crimes altogether. Like that, it's. I mean that we could talk about the details, but for now, just and as a part of it. And I'd like to say that the Japanese government has been doing everything to kind of censor education in Japan and also education in the U.S. And elsewhere, and they even like banned using certain terms in order to kind of to deny the history. And most recently, for example, in like last year, the Japanese government stated that the term, stated that we cannot use the term military comfort women or the so-called military comfort women. And these are the terms that the activists and scholars have like a struggle to kind of use in order to critique the original term, very colonial term, comfort women, which is it's in Japanese, it's ianfu, and like it's the term itself is a part of the colonial violence. And so the scholars have been saying like we have to put like at least Japanese military in front of it, and then put comfort women in quotation mark to problematize the term itself, and to try to stop the violence that the term itself continues to continues. And then but then Japanese government said that we cannot use those terms, but then in official context we have to go back, everyone has to use the colonial term and so forth. And that's one of many attempts that the Japanese government have been doing. And then another thing that I wanted to point out, that denialists are not like those are, they have crazy ideas, like they have totally unfounded claims. However, they actually are hired as a full-time professors at elite institutions such as Tokyo University or like Harvard Law School. And recently we had been dealing with this denialist, who still serves as a professor of Japanese legal studies at Harvard Law School, like J. Mark Ramseyer, who kind of repeated the denialist claims in his published peer-reviewed publication. And then there has been many critiques about his work, which we could talk more about. But anyways, so this is part of what we have been struggling against. And could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So this is like one of the things that the Abe administration did, spending so much money, and to create what is called Japan Chair at a very conservative think tank called Hudson Institute. And it happens that the Hudson Institute is both Zionist and white supremacist. And here this is a president, Kenneth Weinstein, who is a pro-Israel Zionist, and who is presenting awards to Prime Minister Abe at the time, who is also a far-right denialist, and then also like this later, this was 2013, and then later 2020. Am I right? The President Trump at the time actually tried to send the Weinstein to Japan to become an ambassador. That didn't materialize, but there was all these people work really closely together, and then to promote their denialist the knowledge. And more recently, like Hudson Institute had a webinar criticizing Amnesty's recent statement. The resolution about how the Israel as an apartheid state, and many other examples. I think. Could you go to the next slide? And then this whole thing. So like here's another newspaper article which talks about the connections. And maybe could you go to skip this? Yeah, and then the next one, and then the underlining it is like there is the Israel and Japanese government, like there were like Abe, Prime Minister Abe was very much behind making more closer connections with Israel, and both the trade in cyber technologies, military arms, and so forth. And so I wanted to touch upon it, and if you could go to the next slide. And so I'm just wondering what kind of solidarity is possible to defy against the collusion that we are seeing in many. The Hudson Institute is one of many examples where this collusion occurs, and here this is a Comfort Women Just Coalition, it's a hearing before the memorial was established, and I think it was important that the Japanese denialists came to the hearing, and then really shamelessly actually shared the denialist positions in front of the survivor and activists at the Yonsu. But then I think that was important because the denialist showed himself so stupid, and all the denialists showed themselves so stupid and evil, and so that backfired on them. And then Dr. Eric Murphy was a supervisor at the time, and many other supervisors shamed on them, and that became one of the very important moments when the Japanese denialists really failed to actually to take over the U.S. U.S. knowledge production, and so I just wanted to mention that. And then also I think we need to talk about what has been happening with Ahmed as a kind of another important. That is just an important side of resistance, and so I guess I will just stop there. I wanted to say more, but sorry. Back to you, Dr. Abdul Hadi.
Yes, thank you, thank you so much, Dr. Kinakawa. Of course, every single time I sit with you, I learn so much. So I wanted to say a few things in terms of my own sort of introductory comments as an instructor of the co-instructor of these classes. The first one is that I'm just so interested and so excited that we engage in a little bit of oral history. And I particularly know that one of the people we're going to contact next is Supervisor Eric Marr, and say, I really would like to sit and interview you. I know Saleem Shahadeh and I. Saleem is actually studying the history of GOPS, General Union of Palestine Students, in the US and all over the world. And we've been doing a lot of oral history interviews about the history of the Palestine movement and the history of movement in general. And one of the things that you've mentioned my really good brother and comrade Ilyas Rashmawi, who I remember actually staying in our house back in the 80s when we were organizing Palestine Solidarity Committee, GOBS, Union of Palestinian Women's Associations, and so on. And I've met him through his sisters who are also very good friends of mine and also very much involved in human rights. And one of his sisters actually is one of the main organizers for the human rights for the United Nations and has been part of the group that's investigating the US white supremacy, anti-blackness, racism in the US. So you will see her name a lot in the papers. But I'm very much interested also in what happened at UC Davis. Saleem will be elated to hear about that. And I want to say that in terms of also the Teaching Palestine pedagogical praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice project that we have been working on, that is very much part and parcel of thinking about how do we think about the histories that are being erased and speak maybe to the history and in conversation with the call that Professor Kinakawa called around the whole question of Japanese denialism. But I also wanted to also uplift the names of somebody like Terry Collins, the chair of KPOO, who passed, transitioned to the other world in July, who was one of the main leaders of the 68 strike and one of the main supporters of KPOO. And you've mentioned Jamal Dajani and Jas Ghannam and Arab Talk. I think we learn a lot from each other because I also learned a lot from participating in the Day of Remembrance, participating with Buena Vista United Methodist Church, actually meeting Grace Shimizu at the Day of Remembrance and learning about the redress, about the Japanese Latin American movement, the redress movement that has never been addressed. Communities have been actually kidnapped from Latin America and brought to the US, and actually it was a rendition program to be exchanged as prisoners of war. I also was very honored to have been part of the Crystal City commemoration that Grace invited me, Jaime Veve, and Saleem Shahadeh to go and learn about what has happened. And I've also been very much interested and very much committed to the slogan that says, do not repeat history, which also in other contexts, in terms of our Jewish anti-Zionist sisters and brothers, have actually organized many demonstrations, many places against Homeland Security during the height of the Trump administration's attack on immigrants and undocumented people. Not that it has stopped, it's just the rhetoric has lowered, but it continues. And one of their slogans said, never again for anyone, because they would say never again. It is about the Holocaust, about the killing of 6 million Jews during Nazism by the Holocaust, and they were saying never again for anyone, never again for Muslims, never again for undocumented, never again for anti-Asian violence, never again for anyone. That's really, really important, that we actually connect all the issues and make sure that when we are talking about different struggles, we're not exceptionalizing one at the expense of the others. I could go on and on and on, but I wanted to actually mention maybe 3 issues around the whole question of denialism. One, in terms of what's happening in the case of Palestine. And why is it that denialists deny? Denialists deny, Zionism in particular is very much interested in erasing the Palestinian narratives, the Palestinian history, because if you erase the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinian history, you can actually claim that there were no people there. A land without people for a people without a land, which is totally not true. There were Palestinians there. The Zionists knew that, but the Zionists also collaborated with colonialist powers, especially at that time, British colonialism, to figure out how to solve the European anti-Semitic problem, getting rid of the Jews amidst Europeans, and to solve the Zionist problem by actually creating what they called as a homeland for Jews in Palestine, a settler colony at the expense of the Palestinians. And many Zionist leaders, from Jabotinsky to Ben Gurion, to many of them, to Herzl, have actually said many statements about that. It's already very well documented. So it's very important to erase in order to say that there is nobody at fault, that a crime has not been committed, that the crime, for example, of apartheid, that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, as well as many other Palestinian groups, have said Israel is committing apartheid, can get erased, and Israel does not have to face responsibility. And this is the same with denialism, that if nothing has happened, then nobody is responsible. Then it's not really an issue. It is some erratic things here and there going on. The second aspect of it is, I think, is similar probably to the case, and of course we're not conflating context, but it's very similar in the case of the Japanese denialism, is reliance on the stigma and the taboo of shame in order to erase this collective gender and sexual violence. That's actually collective punishment against whole communities. In the Palestinian case, the Israeli state has relied historically on the question that thinking that Orientalism, that Palestinians might not be willing to speak publicly about rape or gender violence and so on, and thus they can actually get away with it, except that they have banked on the wrong thing, because Palestinian prisoners spoke, including women and male prisoners, have spoken about how they have been sexually violated in prison. The torture is not only physical torture, i.e., Palestinian prisoners are not only tortured by electrodes being attached to their genitals and electrocuted, they're not only tortured by cigarette butts grounded in their chest, they're not only tortured by breaking their heads, they're not only tortured by solitary confinement, like what's happening to this young child, Ahmad Manasra now, who's placed in solitary confinement, which we know, being in the Bay Area, we understand from actually watching the Pelican Bay strike in 2013. And what does solitary confinement actually does? It's part of collective punishment against prisoners, to isolate them from each other, to break their spirit. And this is being conducted as I speak today against this young Palestinian Ahmad Manasra and many other prisoners. But also the torture is also sexual, in the sense that the Israeli interrogators actually not only threatened Palestinian women by touching them, by taking off their clothes, by threatening them that they will castrate their brothers and their fathers and their sons, but also they have been raped themselves. But Palestinian women stood up and said, we're going to speak about this. Again, exactly like the so-called comfort women, the women who have been sexually abused and sexually exploited and sexually enslaved by the Japanese military, have also stood up and spoke and proudly said that we see this as a way against us, against our bodies. This is part of our torture. This is not something that we're going to be silent about. We're going to speak about it, despite how painful it is. It's not only about the stigma, but it's also really painful to relive the memories and to relive the trauma of pain that has happened to you individually and that has happened to the community collectively. And so, in a way, in the Palestinian case, as in the case of the comfort women, Palestinian women and men stood up and said, we're going to defy this whole Orientalist and Islamophobic and racist colonialist notion that relies on our silence in order to perpetuate the crime. We're going to stand up and we're going to speak about it. And collectively, they spoke about it. And what happened then, that the community embraced and gave love and got the back of those who've been tortured in all sorts of manners, including sexual torture. As you know, that Palestinian prisoners are revered in Palestinian society. Nobody can actually speak ill of freed Palestinian prisoners. They are the ones who sacrifice. They are the ones who deserve the respect and receive it from the community. And this happened also with the question of the gender and sexual violence that Palestinian women, and also we know, as in the case of the whole question of queer Palestinians also, Israeli interrogators and Israeli intelligence, Mossad and Shin Bet, have actually tried to recruit Palestinian women and Palestinian queers as informants by threatening them that we can expose your relations if you don't become an informer with us and so on. And this is something that Palestinian queer group, for example, Al-Qaws and Aswat, have spoken about and have written about, thus foiling the attempts by Israel. And this is really important to hold accountable who is responsible for the crime, and not to just say forget and forgive. You may want to forgive at some point, but people have to be held accountable. Secondly, saying that this has been going on, and making sure that people understand that it is not only individual, but it's actually a collective crime against humanity. against the community. The other thing is that the whole question of the language, actually, when we were preparing for this program, and also when I was learning more and more from my colleague, Dr. Kinakawa, I looked throughout Arab media around the whole question. There is a lot of writing, and it's very sympathetic. And there's a lot of videos. And actually, I assigned some of them in my classes for students who know Arabic about what has happened with the women. And parentheses, they will put it in parentheses, nisa al-mut'a, and because mut'a means pleasure, and there is nothing pleasurable. We know about rape. There is nothing pleasurable about sexual violence. We know it's about power. It's about hurting people where they are. So this is something that's really, really important. The last thing I would say is that this also very much connects to the need to redress, to need to hold accountable, to need to remember, to refuse to forget, to teach about it, to include it in our studies, to include it in our classrooms, to have people learn about it. Because one thing that happens in the US context, there is this kind of silos, ways in which they try to actually isolate and say, this is an aberration. What happened in the US slavery was an aberration. In settler colonialism, attempt to genocide indigenous people is an aberration. The US is built on all these amazing values, and what happened is an exceptional, and so on. And it's really, really important for us to actually hold all those accountable and say, this is what's going on. You cannot get away with it. We are not going to forget. We are going to hold you accountable. And there needs to be reparations. Reparations, you never compensate for all these crimes. But there needs to be reparations in it. And students really need to understand. The newer generation needs to understand what has happened. And there is a very strong attempt by denialists on every single level to forget history, to reverse it. In the US, even the history of 68 strike at San Francisco State, there is an attempt to sanitize it, to make it just happen as one moment in history that we can romanticize about and move on, and that as if everything is hunky-dory and we can forget about it. But actually, it's really, really important for us to learn from history, to learn from those lessons in order for us to make sure, just like the slogan of the Japanese Latin American and the Day of Remembrance and the community that is organizing the comfort movement, saying again and again and again that never repeat history, never again for anyone. We refuse to exceptionalize. We refuse to rank one oppression over another. We are going to stand with each other. We are going to support each other, and we're actually going to teach about it. And the question of justice-centered knowledge is a legitimate question that the Zionists and the right-wingers and the white supremacists and the denialists would like us to forget about that. But we're not going to forget, because in this lies our own knowledge, lies our own learning, but it also lies into our own liberation, coming up with each other. I will stop at that.
Thank you. So I think we would like to open this up to a round table. So we'll invite more panelists to speak about what we started to discuss. So I'm sorry, so let's and I think we are thinking about making some rounds among the panelists, so we can continue this discussion. And so I think as a kind of a ways into this more collective discussion, I think the questions that actually we shared with you is that it's like where you're coming from politically, professionally, intellectually, and how you have been involved in like a movement, pedagogies, and other work around those issues that we have been discussing: historical denialism, resisting against denialism, and colonialism, and gendered sexual violence, and how does your work relate back to your other movements, other work that you have been involved in. Like, so I think can we start from there? Like, and then if each panelist could kind of respond to what Dr. Abdul Hadi discussed, and also I shared with you, and then also the ceremony itself. Dr. Abdul Hadi, does that work?
Yeah, I think it's okay. I think we can just maybe pose the questions and then take on Professor Miho has not spoken yet, and then go into the way that we planned the panel to have Professor Miho, Ms. Shimizu, Ms. Merck, and then go to the people who have not spoken at the ceremony to kind of like reflect on that. Is that okay as an order? And then see if there are any questions from the floor, we can also insert them as we go along. Is that okay?
And I think like each of you told me like what you wanted to share, and so I think it would be good if you could intervene from your like from where you're coming from, and like speak really about this issue. So let me introduce like Professor Kim, and I'm sorry, let me just looking through the notes. Sorry. So Professor Miho Kim is a third-generation Chinese Korean activist and human rights researcher living in the Bay Area. Miho has been a lecturer at the SFSU Asian American Studies Department since 2019. After 15 years in social justice nonprofit management, followed by a master's program in human rights law. And as a lifelong advocate for Chinese rights, she co-founded the Comfort Women Justice Coalition in 2015 and has been an executive committee member. Miho is also a PhD student at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. And like Professor Kim has been really pivotal both in the Comfort Women Justice movement and also Zionist movement, like here in the area and also and globally. Yeah, and I think I will stop here and let you take over.
Thank you so much. Just to clarify, how many minutes should I talk for?
10 minutes.
Oh, okay. 10 minutes. So, well, I don't even know where to start. This has been just really deeply moving, and it's a great honor to be a part of the space. Thank you so much for all of you for organizing and putting this together, and for the opportunity to connect with your valuable audience and the colleagues and comrades that are here on the screen with me. My name is Miho Kim, and as Professor Kinukawa kindly introduced me, I am a third-generation Zainichi Korean from Japan. And I believe that I was asked to speak about why am I in this struggle. You know, the kind of the political, intellectual, and other motivations. And for me, the answer is very simple, is the fact that I'm Zainichi. Many of you might not be as familiar or have been familiar with the term Zainichi, except in the recent past. Wait, can you see me now? Sorry, I'm having quite a hair day, I can see. But anyway, the novel Pachinko came out, written by Korean-American novelist Min Jin Lee, which has been turned into an Apple TV series show by that same title, Pachinko. And it's been quite a phenomenon in the United States and abroad. This is our 2-minute claim to fame as Zainichi Koreans, because this novel is basically about a Zainichi Korean family over several generations. But, even if you might have heard about us, I just want to take a moment, because I don't want to assume that many of you are familiar with who we are, but I do think it's really, really deeply relevant to today's topic. So let me take a moment to introduce who I am as a Zainichi Korean. First of all, the word Zainichi transliterates to resident in Japan. So there are Zainichi Koreans, referred to often as Zainichi as a shorthand, but actually it's only because we're like over 90% of this whole like post-war former colonial subjects and their descendant kind of population that's from abroad, from places that were occupied and colonized by Japan during World War II. And why was it that we ended up in Japan and that we still remain as Koreans, even though by now about 6th and 7th generation Koreans are born and raised in Japan and only know Japanese language and only know Japan as their home, where their ancestors and are buried on Japanese soil and don't really have any place in the Korean peninsula, the ancestral land to go back to. And it really boils down to a set of this concept of what it means to be Japanese and what it means not to be Japanese that predates the modern era. And this is where the historical context, I think, becomes extremely important. And historical denialism is trying to make this knowledge irrelevant, because without the proper framework, you cannot bring into focus the reality in an accurate sense. You can tell that I'm extremely high-tech person because I have a hand-drawn thing to provide a context for those of you who might not be as familiar with the Japanese ideology of racism. Judge Singh and others talked about the Nazi ideology and the swastika as a symbol of Aryan superiority, and the side-by-side, the rising war flag being next to it. Well, Japan established a modern nation state with the emperor representing the demigod in 1868. And this is the emperor. This is basically the power structure, how the racialization of non-Japanese occurred. And this was a manufactured hierarchy of power relations that created the framework for imperial expansion for the Japanese when it became a modern nation state in 1868. Until then, the emperor was really a weather vane. That's why, politically speaking, it was, this position was used as a pawn between warlords in Japan. Well, that changed with a constitutional monarchy being established, with a constitution, the only one, by the way, in the entire world that completely lacked the provision in terms of the right to education, because they were explicitly clear that education is a means of inculcating the entire population with the mindset necessary for fascist ideology to take root and for the imperial rule over other Asian neighboring nations who were considered heathens and uncivilized and barbaric take place. And for soldiers in the front lines all the way to in the colonial metropole to really embrace that idea of Japanese racial superiority. And so the system of oppression in Japan, because a lot of us in the United States particularly have noticed, white supremacism is the ideology that we understand as a framework for system of oppression. And, racism we understand in a certain way. Well, Koreans, those from Taiwan and, Manchukuo was a fake, puppet regime that Japan established. Ainu, Okinawan people, racially, sometimes you cannot tell us apart. So how is it that racism is possible? And it's not just interpersonal, it's deeply ideological. And that's a backdrop against which you must understand historical denialism being promoted in the way that Professor Kinukawa elaborated for us earlier. And the emperor's basically pyramid, but the emperor is above the pyramid of the power hierarchy because it is a demigod. And there is, the Constitution protected the emperor from any kind of political accountability. And anybody who shared the blood of the emperor as a Japanese race, which no such thing really exists, was considered sacred and pure. And the lower down the totem pole, the pyramid you went, the more filthy and tainted, and therefore warranted the benevolence of the Japanese to expand into places like the Korean Peninsula or further into China and elsewhere to bring the benefit of the opportunity to join this imperial family and join the human race. Now, this was something that the United States, when they occupied Japan, intentionally preserved, at least symbolically, by preserving the emperor as a symbol of a unified Japan, because unity was extremely important to recreate post-war Japan in the image that the US desired as an occupier, as a victorious occupier after World War II. What happened to the 2 million Koreans, that many of whom were brought to Japan to conduct forced labor, such as my grandfather, who, by the way, worked for the family business of the finance minister Aso of Japan, where a lot of the human remains of Chinese and Korean forced laborers still are buried to this day. I went myself and witnessed it a couple years ago. It happens to be my hometown in Fukuoka, Japan. But people like my grandfather who were forced to come to Japan, oftentimes the peasants, from the rural area and oppressed during the feudal era before Korea's colonization, illiterate, with no land, and hardly any economic opportunities. After the war, were stuck in Japan. There are 2 million of them. Half of them were desperate enough to go back by a raft or some kind of a wooden boat or something across the sea. Many of them didn't make it. And then about 1 million that was left, the prime minister that was basically handpicked by the US out of Sugamo prison and is a war criminal, Kishi, who's former Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, by the way, said during the negotiation of San Francisco Treaty, Koreans are either criminals or Reds. Therefore, no matter what, we will not allow them to continue to be Japanese. We forced them to be Japanese because we colonized the Koreans. They were Japanese. But now that Korea is no longer a colonial holding for us, the Koreans that are in Japan, we're not going to make them into Japanese. And yet the Koreans had no place to go, and the US allowed it. And so fast forward 70 plus years, here I am, born and raised in Japan. And the Constitution of Japan, unlike the one in the United States, protects only nationals. And therefore, even compulsory education is a privilege and not a right for us. We've never voted. My family has never ever voted in the history of our family's existence anywhere in the world. The only reason I do is because I'm today a US citizen by grace of higher power. But why this then connects to Comfort Women is that when you deny the history of Japan's imperial expansion, right, and the atrocities that it committed, justified by the ideology of Japanese superiority and the subhuman nature of the foreign Asian neighbors, you basically create the entire context of Zainichi existence and the Comfort Women. Many of the Comfort Women were grandmothers who were young women in the villages where a lot of my ancestors are from. Poorest of the poor, right? Exploited during the feudal era by the ruling class. Hardly any opportunities and abject poverty. These were common across the board. And after the war, discarded and forgotten. Quickly, the Korean War broke out. And so Zainichi Koreans today are people without land, people without a home to go back to. And we are perpetual foreigners. That's very familiar to those of us, especially in the West Coast, as Asian Americans in the United States, even to this day. And the fact that much of the world is not aware that Japan is actually not a mono-ethnic nation, but there's still hundreds of thousands of Zainichi Koreans and Zainichi from other former territories like Taiwan and Manchuria region of China, and so on. And Okinawa is an indigenous, nation. That in itself reflects a long history of Japanese revisionist history that has taken hold. And so when we speak about comfort women, we are actually talking about, putting the truth back into the history and writing empire back into the history of post-war Japan, because that is the only way you can actually bring the truth and the background and stories of our comfort women grandmothers, as well as people like my grandfather, who was a forced laborer, right? Into the light of the day. And the somebody like in Japan as Israel of Asia, and that's a phrase maybe some of you have heard many times before. The thing is, there are these central core of people that are actively denying history, right? The Japanese historical denialists, and then the Zionists, right? And then people that claim slavery never occurred, or Native American genocide never occurred in the United States. But the thing is, when denialism is unchecked and it even joins the mainstream flow, then it creates so much room for complicity, because by the forgetting happens. There is the silencing, and there's complete absence of the voices of the people that were denied, who's, denying history is denying the existence of some of the people that were affected directly by that history that is being denied, right? And so I think basically, and another, sorry, I'm just aware of the time, so I'm gonna wrap up. But another thing that I wanted to mention is, Dr. Abdul Hadi mentioned, this whole function of subordinating women in the context of, denying history of the violence against an entire people, right? And I think it's no secret that, say, militarism, is basically, it's masculinity as foreign policy, and as such, there's inherently a skewing of power between men and women, and I think in a colonial context, such as one that my community has experienced, and I wonder if this is another point of resonating with each other, with other communities in colonial contexts, is that it turns our own men in our own communities against women in a way that's normalized, and and also because, like in the Korean context, we have long ingrained patriarchy by Confucianism, and it accelerates the destruction of community from within, but in a way that actually gains much benefits for the empire. And I think for women, the course for redemption then becomes feminized beauty, or and like purity, and / or bearing like future soldiers for the empire, or fulfilling the patriotic duty, if you will. And for people that have been used for the comfort of other soldiers, like comfort women, neither is a viable course for keeping dignity intact and joining society. And this collective punishment, so long as we are broken and isolated from each other by turning, women, away, by leveraging the pre-existing structure of patriarchy, is further complicating our struggles to even begin healing on a personal level. And, the denialism of what has been done against the Palestinian people, and the denialism, of what has been done to the former colonial subjects of the Japanese Empire. There's a much, for me, that resonates on a deeply emotional and visceral level. And one last thing I'll mention is that, actually, Japanese far left, much of those struggles were inspired by the liberation struggles for Palestine way back decades. And in fact, the militarized, above ground militarized wing of the far left struggles of Japan even started out of Palestine. And so, I think that even though we are perpetual foreigners, as people that are still fighting for permanent belonging in the land that we are born and surely will be buried with our families, there is a powerful legacy for us to really build on as people from Japan. And so, it's in that sense, I think there's just a lot that we can build on. And I'll pause here as an opening.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kim. Just before I introduce the next speaker, I just want to briefly refer to the graphic that we used in our flyer, which is the Carlos Latu's graphic about Japanese denialism, and he's a Brazilian political cartoonist and who has been who has been drawing about Palestine, about the Japanese denialism and white supremacy and so forth, and very powerful work. And I just wanted to mention that he also drew the cartoon, for Dr. Abdul Hadi's struggle at Ahmed at SFSU, and so he's another very important, I would say, intellectual who connects those movements, and appreciates Dr. Abdul Hadi's struggle, and also I think who also speaks for those of us who suffer from Japanese imperialism and resist against it. And so I just wanted to mention that. And then I'd like to go to the next speaker, which is Grace Shimizu, and her full bio is is posted. I will read part of it. Grace Shimizu has been committed to social justice education and activism, community building and empowerment, and international solidarity for over 50 years. Ms. Shimizu serves as an executive committee member of the San Francisco Bay Area for Women Justice Coalition, director of the Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project, and director of the Campaign for Justice Redress Now for Japanese Latin Americans. Through this work, she advances the struggles for full disclosure, government accountability, and reparations for World War II war crimes perpetrated by the Japanese government through its sex slavery system against over 400,000 women and children from 13 countries, as well as the gross human rights violations of the US government through its Latin American program of rendition, internment, and hostage exchange against more than 6,000 men, women, and children of Japanese, German, Italian, and Jewish ancestry from 18 Latin American countries. For the past 6 years, Ms. Shimizu has been a strong supporter of Ahmed Studies and its director, Dr. Abdul Hadi, participating in classroom presentations and campus events, and building solidarity between campus and community, particularly in the defense against attacks by the SFSU administration in collusion with Zionist organizations and private tech corporations in violation of academic freedom, the creation of hostile work and study environments, and in undermining the Ahmed program. So.
Okay. All right. We only got like, 15 minutes. So I'll try and be real brief. And I think what I wanted to focus on is really just underscoring some stuff around historical denialism and why it's important to resist it. So here we see historical denialism, whether it's in the case of the Zionists or the Japanese right wing and their states, trying to falsify or distort the historical record. And what they're trying to do is interpret the past to serve political and ideological purpose. They're using pseudo-history to craft a sense of national identity, ideological identity, and public memory. So in this way, they want to justify and legitimize their political aim on a national and international level. So they're creating a national memory, which is integral to creation of this national identity. And we see the use of symbols like the flags, the myths, rituals, ceremony, objects, so they can create a common narrative. So whether it's the Zionists or Japanese right-wing groups or their governments, we are seeing a common playbook of manufacturing the enemy, demonizing the enemy, the government and media lies, asserting military necessity and national security, repression of journalists, whistleblowers, educators, the taking over of civil spaces, and the normalization of militarism, police brutality, mass detention, and never-ending war and war profiteering. So in this, resistance is really key, the fight back, because it's not only a part of the history that's trying to be being erased, but it's part of the history in the making. So we, in the different communities, in the different social justice movement, we have lots to learn from each other. And some of it is the strategy and tactics of these right wings, these fascists, but also, and more importantly, the strategy and tactics of resistance and how to deal with our accomplishments, the attempts at co-optation, and how to keep on moving the struggle. So that's good enough for me. I'm sure there's other folks who want to say something.
Okay. Ooh. My apologies. I lost my computer again. Professor Kinakawa, can you introduce Ms. Merkelson, Judith Merkelson? I somehow my computer screen disappeared.
Okay, so let me introduce Judith Merkinson. She's a long-time human and women's rights worker specializing in the relationship between militarism and gender violence, an anti-imperialist, feminist, and anti-Zionist. She first began working for justice for the Comfort Women in 1993, when she co-sponsored the first North American tour of a Filipina survivor with Gabriela Philippines. She's a former president and current board member of the San Francisco Bay Area National Lawyers Guild and is the president of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition.
Well, my brilliant colleagues have basically covered everything. So I will also just, and I see that there's very little time, so I will just say a few things. I agree completely. Historical denialism is creating a different narrative and creating what's considered normal and acceptable. Really, I think what people don't realize sometimes when we're talking about denialism is the history that we are taught about the United States is a history of historical denialism. You know, whether you're talking about, you know, the founding fathers, which is the most ridiculous concept, or the history of the enslavement for hundreds of years of African people, or the genocide of Native Americans, or just the roles that different people have played in the history of the United States. And so that gets extended then throughout the world in terms of our own worldview. And you can see it quite clearly right now when they talk about the war in Ukraine, and they talk about, this is a war of civilizations, our civilizations, when they talk about how we're bringing democracy, when we don't really even have democracy here, like a concept of democracy. So that's all when we're thinking about historical denialism, that's what we're talking about. And I agree completely with what Grace and Miho talked about, that denialism leads to fascism and leads to nationalism and leads to war. And the other thing I would say is, and to back up what Miho spoke about, is that historical denialism and the histories that we are taught are the histories of the few, and it denies the voices. And that's why we always say we have to be the voice of those who are the voiceless. And this is particularly true in this country for people of color. And it's also particularly true for women and queer people, that we are not represented. Our voices are not valued. And because our voices are not valued, then the way that we are talked about is is a myth, and really what we're talking about is that historical denialism is lies. It's fake news in its biggest sense. So I think the thing, when you deny the voices of women, then you allow women to be sexually enslaved, you allow women to be oppressed, and you allow women to be sexually abused. And that is what we're trying to think. And the irony of the situation, which Professor Abdul also talked about a bit, is that when women are sexually abused, it becomes our shame. It's not the shame of the men who do it, it's the shame of the women. When poor people are oppressed, one of the other ways is that it's their problem. It's not the problem of those who oppress, it's the problem of the people who are oppressed. And, in Israel, the victims become the oppressors and the oppressors become the victims. And that is also a really important part of historical denialism. And we are looking, I think, for students and for all of us, right now, we're in a very dangerous period in history, and Steve and other people talked about that we're in this very dangerous part where wars are happening throughout the planet, although we only hear about the one in Ukraine, while there's ones in Palestine, there are one in Yemen, there's ones in Haiti, there are wars happening throughout the African continent. And so in a very dangerous period, it's very important that we seek out the truth, and that we also understand that when there is war, there is gender violence. And so that is a very important for all of us to seek out the truth and to try to change what we actually know is going on. So I'll just leave it there as well.
Great. That's good. Just jump in.
So we were wondering if, thank you so much. And thank you for actually being so brief, Grace and Merck. I know you have so much more to say, but it's like really represents the spirit of collective work with each other and our coming together. And we still have with us Steve and Eric. So we were wondering if you would like, maybe we can go around and everybody can just make maybe one minute concluding statements. We don't have questions. We have just people who are supporting from the floor. And so we will go with Steve, Eric, and go back to Miho, Merck, and Grace, and then Tomomi and I can close it up. So go for it, Steve.
Okay, well, I think this has been a very important discussion class, linking up these experiences and struggles globally on denialism and how it's affected working people and women and Palestinians and other people around the world. And I think we have to continue these links, because it's only by making these connections and linking up our struggles in this country and globally can we really defend people. we can't connect without connecting these struggles. We're isolated, and we don't see the historical connections that are critical in understanding. And denialism is about denying the history of people around the world, of cultures, of communities. And so our struggle really to make these connections, to struggle to unify and defend the people and these struggles are critical for all working people and the people of the world.
And I'll just add that I'm humbled. I've learned so much from all of you. And as Grace just said, how we organize and learn from and inform our fight back together, united, is so critical. To the young people who are listening, I'll just say, don't trust the corporate media, as Steve said and others said. Really rely on the grassroots networks, the women and the feminists and the indigenous and the movements for self-determination that tell our narrative stories. So don't trust the corporate media. And I'll just say that I have really enjoyed and learned a hell of a lot from all of you, but thank you so much.
Am I next? Mm-hmm. I want to say, denying history is also, really who benefits most is empire. And I think the mechanism of empire goes far beyond domestic borders, and that U.S. is an intrinsically critical part of upholding Zionism and also Japanese fascist ideology of imperial ideology, Tennōsei, that keep the people who are kept down. And I think, like Professor Mara Eric mentioned earlier, listening to the voices of people who have been silenced and is extremely important. So like when you hear a word like comfort women, for whose comfort were they comfort women, right? Just to ask that question, whose perspective is that labeling coming from, right? And I think that's going to be the critical kind of antenna that is warranted for all of us to develop. And I just want to finally point out that, it's not a coincidence that when it comes to restoring justice and equity in a society, there is invariably a necessity for investigation of truth, right? We have truth commissions and also prevention of recurrence of history and preserving, historical memorials. And continuing education. Why? Is because denying what has happened is a known vehicle for spreading hate. And which is exactly why in Europe it is illegal to spread anti-Semitism, because it is acknowledged as such and is a very potent vehicle for anti-Semitism. And that can be said for denialism going on in our respective communities. So thank you so much for raising space for this important conversation.
I would like to say that, when we built the statue, the Japanese government did everything, and as Eric has talked about, to deny the statue from happening. They were determined. And at every single juncture, we had to fight the Japanese government. People said to us, what? Why are they doing all that for a statue? Like, why do they care? And we would say, well, they obviously do care. And it's something particular. It's not just, it's about how women and the subjugation of women fits into the narrative of empire and fascism. And we can see that in our own country as reproductive rights are being curtailed, as the issue of gender and sexuality is being curtailed. And we can see that throughout Europe too. And so I think that that's how you look, just to bring it sort of full circle for CWJC, that you can bring it full circle about the relationship of gender and gender violence to the whole history of historical denialism. It's one key aspect, and that's why we continue to do our work. We don't leave the issue of the comfort women in the past. It's just some horrible thing that happened to hundreds of thousands of women. What we do is we say this relationship of gender violence and the solving of it and the getting of justice for the memories of these women and for the few survivors that are left are critical in our fight against nationalism, war, militarization, and fascism.
Thank you, Merk. Just with our audience, just bear with us a few more minutes because we just want to be able to close the circle. So we have Grace Shimizu, Dr. Tekinakawa, and myself, or the other way around. Grace, please go for it.
Thank you. By understanding our history and drawing insights, lessons, and inspiration from our struggles, we can advance our envisioning and building towards a future of peace, well-being, dignity, genuine security, and justice for all. We can change the future reality of this nation and the world. This is our responsibility. And the stakes are too high and immediate to be in denial. We need everyone's brain power and heart and activism so we can move forward together. And this is wonderful. We got each other.
Professor Kinakawa? Well, I'll say a couple of words and you can close. So for me, I think I'm really thankful for everybody. I'm just appreciative of being in this space. This is so rejuvenating. We talk about the pain, but we also talk about struggling with each other. And that there is nothing more beautiful than coming together and having each other's backs and showing love for the community. I think this is a couple of things that brings up the whole question, what does it mean to center the voices of the marginalized and not to center the dominant hegemonic narratives and so on? That's really, really on our own terms. And I think it's not really accidental that we came together and Professor Kinakawa and I, the labor of love that we've been, and the pain that we've been enduring for the last, what was it, over now more than 500 students, and in 2.5 years of collaboration, actually, we saw each other at the statue, at the Comfort Women statue at the National Women's Studies Association back in 2019. So I'm just so grateful. And thank you all. And I'm turning it back to you, Professor Kinakawa, to close us off.
You're muted.
Sorry, so I think one thing I wanted to add, like everything is already said, but like what Dr. Abdul Hadi and Mr. Dajani did for us, the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, I think it's that involved like labor, and that involved make speaking of which there is a risk in speaking in that way. I think within our own, in this case their community, and also like I think so. That's what I have been thinking about, like making like when we are crossing movements, like like the issues like we need to. I mean that to think about like how we do make ourselves actually accountable for our own communities, and then like let's speak take unpopular positions, and that produces certain kind of labor. And I think that's something I'm just thinking that that's kind of like an important part of the comparative historical denialism, and like defying the oppression Olympic, which kind of ends our power of imagination at the kind of outer edge of our own community, and then prevents or like denies us to kind of to look in our eyes like the violence that is going on right in front of us, or like even in the midst of us. And so I think that kind of the both like a closing borders, but also and then also like being kind of rooted in here now, I think that's also very much important too. So I think like so, and to be continued. So thank you so much. So I think this will conclude Open Classroom Thank you so much.